Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. Now, as promised, we are back to our regularly scheduled programming. Of course, last week we had our WWDC special, where we pretty much only covered what went on at WWDC. So if you haven't listened to that episode and you're interested, definitely go check that out after this week's episode. But this week we are back to our normal, regularly scheduled programming with our trivia, nerdy stuff, and cybersecurity tip. And man, was there a lot of cybersecurity related goings on and news happening this week, so we got a decent amount to talk about. But first, let's start off with our trivia question. So perhaps in inspiration of WWDC last week, this question is tangentially related, and that being, what year was the Swift programming language announced? So what year was the Swift programming language announced? And that is your trivia question for the week. So the first of these cybersecurity-themed news stories I wanted to touch on comes to us from the good old European Union. So the EU has been kind of front and center for good and for bad over the past few years now. They're pretty famous with their whole Digital Markets Act, I believe is what it's called, essentially trying to, force companies like Apple to try to stop being a monopoly, forcing them to go to USB-C rather than using Lightning, things like that. So they've been kind of all in the news on both being praised and being ridiculed, and I think this one kind of falls into the ridiculed category, at least from certain privacy-focused companies and myself. Now, for what it's worth, I do not live in the EU, so, I guess I'm kind of making fun of them and hating on them, even though I don't have to reap any of the repercussions. But I think it's safe to say that the EU is probably not alone in their belief of what they want to address. So without further ado, let's just get into it. So the proposal put forth by the European Union is to scan users' private messages for detection of child sexual abuse material, or CSAM. So essentially what the European Union wants to do is to be able to scan all of your text messages to make sure you're not sending any illicit materials. So why is this a problem? Because, of course, we have to think of the children here. And that's usually the route that companies and organizations go down when they put forth rather controversial cybersecurity-related proposals like this, is they always bring up the children first because, of course, you have to think of the children and protect the children. And the reason why this is a problem is we are going to take an objective look at this, because if you get hyper-focused on the children aspect, which the European Union is kind of trying to push here, you kind of lose sight of the bigger picture here, because the problem with allowing anyone, whether that's a government organization, a company, a threat actor, whoever it is, allowing anyone the ability to read private messages that are not intended for them completely undermines the goals and the purpose of end-to-end encryption. And I think the president of the Signal Foundation said it pretty well when they said, quote, "Mandating mass scanning of private communications fundamentally undermines encryption, full stop," end quote, which I 100% agree with. They also are, I guess, in this proposal, they're adding a new provision called, quote, upload moderation, which, if that name by itself doesn't tell you what you need to know, that basically allows for messages to be scrutinized ahead of the actual encryption process. So essentially what they're trying to do is bypass the encryption by sending them a copy before you actually send it to your intended target. So in a way, it's almost like a man-in-the-middle attack, except you're deliberately sending it to someone else before it goes on to your intended recipient, rather than you just thinking it's going to your intended recipient, but someone's actually in the middle kind of sniffing on that traffic. So essentially, you're uploading your message before it gets encrypted, so presumably the EU can make sure you aren't doing anything or sending anything you shouldn't be sending, which, of course, in their argument for this specific case is related specifically to CSAM, although as others have pointed out, as we'll get to, that's usually not where it stops. It's kind of getting your foot in the door, and is a rather slippery slope, if you ask me. So in essence, they're basically asking you to allow them to spy on you and read everything that you say, is essentially what's going on here. And Europol, which I'm not 100% sure, but I believe they have something to do with someone in the EU can obviously correct me, but I believe they have something to do with like either the law enforcement or somewhere in that realm within the European Union. But anyway, Europol basically said, in essence, to eliminate end-to-end encryption without actually saying it is basically what they got to. So they didn't say we want to get rid of end-to-end encryption, but they kind of said that. So what they said is they're calling on the tech industry and governments to prioritize public safety, warning that security measures like end-to-end encryption could prevent law enforcement agencies from accessing problematic content. And they go on to say that it calls for platforms to design security systems in such a way that they can still identify and report harmful and illegal activities to law enforcement without delving into the implementation specifics. So essentially what they're saying here is, hey, companies and governments, you can still have your encryption if you want to, but make sure you give us a back door so we can get in there in case anything spooky's going on, so we can make sure you're all doing what you're supposed to. So yeah, they're basically calling for a locked door, or not a locked door, a back door. And in all honesty, all a backdoor is an intentionally placed security vulnerability. Because as soon as you put a backdoor into anything, whether it's a piece of software or even at the hardware level, if you put a backdoor into something, you essentially just started a countdown clock until a threat actor is able to discover said backdoor and then can use it for malicious reasons. And especially if you are a government agency, for instance, calling on companies to implement backdoors, you're basically just giving all the threat actors out there a heads up, like, hey, we want this backdoor to be in this case, you could say Signal, for instance. We want a backdoor in Signal, so hey, threat actors, FYI, there might be a backdoor coming, so be on the lookout. That's what the threat actors, of course, are hearing from all of this. So, yeah, I would honestly be quite curious to know how these government organizations would like. So essentially what they're doing here, right, is they're kind of wanting to remove end-to-end encryption. So what I would be interested in knowing is if they would be okay in removing all of the end-to-end encryption from all of their classified information that they're sending to one another to ensure that no illegal material was also being sent in there. And I'm not a betting man or anything, but if I were to wager, I would suspect that they would be strongly opposed to removing the encryption on their transferring of classified information. But that's just me. Now, personally, I think that's a little bit hypocritical. Now, of course, you can make the argument of, is your private messages to the same level of severity as, say, national security information? And you can, make that argument if you want to, sure. But the fact of the matter is, they're basically saying you cannot have encryption, but we, the government, can. So essentially, they're kind of, gatekeeping and trying to control what you can and cannot do, which I'll let you make your own conclusion on that. But quoting Signal again here, scanning for one type of content or instance opens the door for bulk surveillance that could create a desire to search other encrypted messaging systems across content types. So again, like I mentioned previously, others are also saying that this is essentially a slippery slope, that once you start trying to scan for one type of content, that basically opens the door to allow you to scan for other types of content. And usually, at least in the past years, it seems like the way to get your foot in the door is you go with either a think of the children approach, or you go with something that is generally universally liked so you can get your foot in the door, and then you can proceed to do the other types of surveillance that you want to do. And as you might expect from all this talk about essentially mass surveillance and backdoors wanting to be put in encryption, this, of course, is not the first time that I believe even the first time the EU has been the culprit of this, of essentially wanting backdoors into encryption. This isn't the first time that governments have been calling for this. But as you might expect, a lot of companies are also sounding the alarm, and it's not just Signal. So Proton, Thema, Access Now, Mozilla, and others have all been sounding the alarm, essentially kind of dittoing what Signal has said. And I think Therma and Proton specifically, along with Signal, had some really good quotes that I'll just end this conversation with here. But basically, suffice it to say that I'm not, a crazy person when I say this. Of course, actual companies, privacy-focused companies are also saying this as well. So starting off with Signal, they said, quote, either end-to-end encryption protects people and enshrines security and privacy, or it is broken for everyone. And breaking end-to-end encryption, particularly at such a geopolitically volatile time, is a dangerous proposition. And then quoting Thema here, they said, quote, it doesn't matter how the EU Commission is trying to sell it as client-side scanning, upload moderation, or AI detection, chat control is still mass surveillance, and regardless of its technical implementation, mass surveillance is always an incredibly bad idea. So, very well said, in my opinion. So with that, let's move into this week's cybersecurity tip. I literally just had this thought as I mentioned getting into this week's cybersecurity tip, that this week would have been perfect to give that cybersecurity tip about your encryption is only as strong as you let it, because it kind of ties into what we just talked about. But I wanted to kind of pivot to something a little bit different, which is something that sometimes comes up rather frequently, which is the idea of updating or deleting accounts when someone no longer requires access to them. So for instance, if they leave the company or they leave the certain department they're in, or whatever the case may be, if they have an account for some service that they no longer need, you should delete their account. And if they by chance had a shared password with someone, so for instance, if you have a local administrator account on a server or something that the IT staff share, that should be something that you should be updating whenever someone moves on and no longer needs access to it. Because essentially what you're potentially allowing for is someone that is no longer authorized gaining authorized access to a system that they shouldn't have access for. And this again, of course, goes back to the principle of least privilege. And one of the reasons I'm actually bringing this up is I was listening to a podcast the other day, Darknet Diaries. Some of you may or may not be familiar with it, but one of the stories that they were covering in this particular episode was essentially this guy. He hacked into a former employer's network because in part, because they forgot to change the passwords. After 4 years of him being gone, they still had not changed the passwords for some of the shared accounts. So, yeah, granted, you shouldn't be going after and hacking former employers in general. I definitely do not condone that. But one way to help prevent potential disgruntled employees or rogue employees that have left the company years later trying to hack you, a good way to help prevent, not necessarily ensure that it doesn't happen, but help prevent that from happening, is to changing your passwords. Now, I have said in the past that, the whole changing your password every 90 days is kind of pointless, or it's not necessarily as big of a deal as someone make it out to be, which could potentially be seen as a hot take. But the angle I was coming at with that was for your personal accounts where there hasn't been any kind of potential data breach out there. If you're using good, strong, secure passwords and you're using two-factor authentication, there really honestly isn't a whole lot of a concern keeping the same password for a while. The only time that you want to be sure you're changing your passwords is if you have any potential inkling to a potential disclosure of that password, whether you maybe gave access to someone to your account so they could do something on your behalf, then that'd be a time where you'd want to change your password to make sure that they can't get access to it again when they no longer need access to it. If you heard from a company or telling you directly that there was a potential data breach, or from maybe if you subscribe to something like LifeLock or something and they'll tell you about potential data breaches, those are the times where you really want to make sure you're going in and changing your passwords. Kind of similar to this, when someone potentially had access to an account that they, of course, no longer need access for, and that's when you should be changing your passwords definitively. Now, of course, if you followed the rule of changing your passwords every 90 days, every 60 days, or whatever, that kind of helps. It kind of helps in this process because you're always going to be changing and updating your passwords anyway. But these are specifically the times that you really want to make sure that you're changing your passwords. And I would argue, even if you are changing them on a recurring basis, whether that's every 60 days or 90 days, whatever the case may be, if you have someone, say, in your IT department that leaves the company, you should be changing any potential passwords that they would have had access to, regardless of if you had recently just changed them, or if you're going to be changing them in, say, 2 weeks, you should be changing them now, because just as a precautionary measure. And this, again, like I mentioned before, goes back to the principle of least privilege, because just because in that case of the Darknet Diaries story, that guy didn't even have physical access to any of the systems. He was able to essentially hack in remotely because he knew, first off, he got a password to, I believe it was their Office 365 portal, and then through there he was able to do some digging into some emails, figure out what the password scheme was for the VPN, and then tunnel into the network and wreak havoc. So just because someone leaves your company or leaves your organization doesn't necessarily mean that they can't potentially do any harm. Now, of course, I'm not saying that anyone that either leaves voluntarily or gets fired or whatever the case may be is going to be out for you and trying to get revenge. Of course not. I mean, it's generally not. Most people, they're just going to move on with their lives. But that's one of the security measures that you have to take, and a precautionary measure that you need to be taking. And it just goes back to the principle of least privilege, because you shouldn't be leaving something around if it doesn't need to have access to it, right? So whether that's a password that was a shared password, if you change that password, the previous person that got let go, they wouldn't know the new password, so they wouldn't have access, or removing their old accounts that of course they no longer need, so they can't try to log in with those accounts. So going back again to the principle of least privilege. So that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Now, the other cybersecurity story I wanted to get to was dealing with Windows. And this honestly ties in pretty good with a couple weeks ago when we had that question from one of you all about asking about, potential trying to do various attacks based on Wi-Fi. So Microsoft recently plugged a security hole in the Windows Wi-Fi driver. And essentially, if you were able to perform this particular exploit, it would allow attackers to run malicious code on vulnerable systems over Wi-Fi. Now, keep in mind that because this is a driver level bug, or a kernel level bug, if you will, if an attacker were able to exploit this, whatever code that they would be running would essentially be running with system level privileges, or kernel level privileges, or basically the highest level of privilege that they can have, and they'll basically be able to do whatever they want without question. So in other words, unlike some types of exploits where someone could, say, hack into a user level application, they would have to do some sort of privilege escalation in order to be able to run those commands at the system level. So basically, if you were practicing good cybersecurity fundamentals and you were just logged into your Windows computer as a standard Windows user and not an admin like most people are, even if you were logged in as a standard Windows user, because the threat actor would be exploiting code running at essentially the kernel level, it wouldn't matter that you were running as a standard Windows user, because they got access to a kernel level process. In essence, they would now have kernel level permissions. So this Wi-Fi attack specifically bypasses all authentication protocols and does not require prior access, and requires no user interaction at all. So essentially, there hasn't been a whole lot disclosed about the specifics of this, probably because Microsoft doesn't want this to be actively exploited, because apparently it's pretty easy to do from what I've heard. But essentially, most likely what's going on here is somewhere in the process, when your computer tries to discover what Wi-Fi, networks are around, there has to be some communication going on between your device's Wi-Fi card and the Wi-Fi access points themselves, in order for them to be able to be discoverable. And my assumption is somewhere in this process there was some kind of, whether it was a buffer overflow or some other kind of exploit, packet forming exploit or something, that someone could deploy to your Wi-Fi card and essentially be able to exploit malicious code. I'm not entirely sure, since, like I said, there hasn't been a ton of specifics on this, but the CVE itself only ended up scoring an 8.8 out of 10. And the reason for that is, of course, this being Wi-Fi based, because as I kind of alluded to at the very beginning of this section here, because this is a Wi-Fi based attack, kind of like what the listener from a couple weeks ago had pointed out, in order to actually perform Wi-Fi based attacks specifically, like if you want to specifically target a Wi-Fi network, or in this case target a device's Wi-Fi driver, you have to be within range of that Wi-Fi network, or that computer in this case, in order to perform that attack. Because, of course, Wi-Fi only has a range so far. So that's the reason why it only gets an 8.8 out of 10 rather than a perfect 10. Now, if this was, say, like any device that was plugged in with an Ethernet cable or something, regardless of if it was behind a firewall and this could happen, then yeah, of course, that would be a 10 out of 10. Almost certainly. But because you have to be within range of this system, that's why it doesn't score quite as high. Because it's a similar thing if you see certain computers with like hardware level vulnerabilities, like a BIOS level vulnerability or something like that, where you need physical access to the system in order to be able to exploit it. Those also, of course, tend to score lower because the fact that you need to have physical access to the system. In this case, you need to be physically close to the system. It essentially adds not necessarily a level of difficulty, but it's not something that you can just be doing from the comfort of your own couch in your PJs or whatever, munching on some popcorn, right? It's not something you can just do from your house. You actually have to be close to the person that you're trying to attack. Again, of course, unless you're trying to be a very bad neighbor and you're trying to exploit your neighbor, which again, do not do, please. But that would be the only time that you could perform an attack like this in your pajamas while eating popcorn. Now, as I did mention, Microsoft did release a patch for this, so definitely if you are using Windows, make sure that you are running the latest Windows updates in order to make sure that you have this patch. And with that, let's move on into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So this first thing I'm going to mention actually caught me off guard. So apparently, people are actually using my stuff. And what I mean by that is I got a message this week from a guy, I believe it was through LinkedIn that he reached out to me. And he was telling me that he was trying to run my Apple RAID admin Docker container for the Xserve RAID, and it wasn't working. So first off, I was completely confused because I was like, wait, someone's actually asking a question about a piece of software I wrote that they're actually trying to use it? What? I think it probably was a first, that I've actually had someone reach out. But anyway, getting back to the point here. So essentially what happened was he was trying to run the Docker container that I made, and he was running it through the Docker Compose, of course, like I mentioned to do in the README. But for whatever reason, it wasn't working. So, but initially I was a little skeptical because he was like, I tried to use it and it didn't work. And I was like, okay, can you give me a little more than that? Like maybe some logs or what specifically about it isn't working? Because I'm like, personally, when I hear someone saying like, specifically in this case with the RAID admin thing, they say it doesn't work. I'm like, okay, so is the Docker Compose failing? Are you not able to log into it? Do you have the password wrong? Like, there's a lot of stuff I'm thinking about here. So I was like, can you give me a little more to work with here? So he ended up sending me his log file, and I took a look at it, and turned out to be quite a simple issue. So basically what had happened was he was using a MacBook Air. He was using an Apple Silicon-based MacBook Air, which of course is ARM-based. And the Java package that has to be installed for the RAID admin utility to work, it only exists for x86. So in essence, he was trying to install an x86 package on an ARM system, which was causing the error. But regardless, it was still really cool to see someone trying to make use of a tool I made. And of course, once I discovered this, I let him know. I was like, hey, so it looks like you're trying to run this on an Apple Silicon machine, which is ARM, and the package that's trying to be pulled is x86, so they're not compatible. So maybe if you try to use an x86 machine, you'd probably have better luck. So, basically give that a try. And he said he'd give it a shot. And I said, cool. If you have any other issues, let me know. I haven't heard anything back, so I'm assuming everything's working for him. But yeah, anyway, I just thought it was kind of cool, basically providing some tech support for this guy. And honestly, I was just happy to see that someone besides me was making use of this tool, because I know it was something that I was kind of looking for when I first started getting into the Xserve RAID, and of course it didn't exist, at least not that I could find, so I decided to make it. So it's cool that someone else is making use of the tool. In other news, it's been a while since I talked about some of the video game updates that I've been working on, and this week I made some updates. So I added item support to the Pokemon game. So this has been one thing that I was kind of knew would have to be implemented at some point, and I didn't fully implement it, but I got essentially the basics implemented. So in essence, like wherever items are kind of displayed, so like when you're in the party selection menu, you'll see that little icon next to the Pokemon displaying that they're holding an item, and then of course in each individual summary screen it says what item they're holding. I essentially added the logic to get that populated properly, so it'll actually check to see what item the Pokemon is holding, and that item is essentially just it checks the held item the Pokemon's holding, which is literally just an ID to the item they're holding, and then that goes and pulls the actual item from the dictionary, which will then pull the name of the item and populate it properly. So I was definitely happy to get that implemented, and I guess at this point, I probably should address the elephant in the room, which is the fact that over the past few weeks, of course, last week kind of being an outlier because it was WWDC and all that, and we didn't talk about anything nerdy at all. The nerdy thing segments over the past few weeks have been sparse at best, and I think that's probably putting it charitably. And I'm not going to get like specifically into what's going on, but needless to say, I've been a little preoccupied with other things at the moment. That are honestly not nearly as enjoyable as working on my video game or playing with my home lab and possibly breaking something. And as you probably have noticed by the relative lightness in the nerdy things segments, I guess I should say, I haven't really had a ton of time to devote to things that I'd rather be doing, like the aforementioned, working on my video game or messing around with my home lab. But I noticed something. Maybe it was because I hadn't done much nerdy stuff in the past few weeks or what it was, but I noticed that when I was working on these updates to like the item system and everything, and just trying to get that initial integration working into my video game, it was honestly like the words I can describe this as is very peaceful, tranquil, and honestly quite meditative. And to be fair, I know this probably sounds weird to some people, because some people, they look at code and go in and basically have a panic attack when they see walls of code on a screen, right? But of course, that is, as you can tell, that is not the case for me at all. And I will say the other thing of it too was it was one of those things that I didn't notice in the moment. Like when I was, working on the code and, working on these feature here, I was just focused on, trying to get this thing implemented, right? So I didn't necessarily notice in the moment, but when I finished my development session and got the basics of items working, I noticed afterwards that I just felt really good, like recharged and re-energized. Like I don't know, I just felt like really good. And essentially for that roughly 2-ish hours or so that I was, working on this and trying to get it implemented, it was like the world no longer existed, and it was essentially just me and the code, just me, the IDE, and the code just kind of working in harmony together, if you will. Any cares, stresses, or problems that I was, potentially facing in the moment just kind of evaporated and melted away. And it was basically this level of escapism that, quite honestly, I haven't had in I don't know how long. And first, I guess I'll touch on what is escapism if you're not familiar with the term. So basically, the idea of escapism, the best way I can put it, is essentially enveloping yourself into something to the point where you basically forget about the world for a while. So some of the more common examples that people generally tend to get this with is what is like watching a movie, watching a TV show, or reading a book or something like that. And essentially, in these examples, they essentially escape into that universe and just get enthralled with the story to the point where they either forget about the actual world, or they feel like they get transported to or transplanted into that universe where the story is taking place. Now, I'm not here to argue one way or the other, but one common argument I hear some people voice why they don't want, common issues that we're facing today, or current events, politics, any of that kind of stuff in media they consume, is because it breaks this escapism factor and kind of reminds them of the world they live in and doesn't provide them with that escape and joy that they want. So since the goal is of escapism in this case is not to think about the world that you're living in and being lectured about all the problems in the world, having those problems kind of on full display right in front of you when you're trying to avoid them is essentially not what people are looking for, which is kind of where the argument comes from. Now, of course, on the other hand, that's not to say that these various topics should be avoided. There's definitely a place for them, and I'm not saying that they shouldn't be addressed at all. I'm just, bringing up the argument that some people make of why they don't want it in certain forms of media that they consume. Anyway, tangent aside, I guess the the TLDR here is some people find happiness in reading a book they love in like a quiet room or watching their favorite movie. But in this case, for me anyway, it was writing code for a project I love. Now, on the one hand, this is kind of ironic because this same video game that I experienced this escapism with is also the same game that had me wanting to chuck my computer out the window for a good solid week straight when I couldn't figure out some of the various memory issues I was running into. Because if you remember back, it was probably over a year ago at this point, I essentially went on, well, I've gone on a couple of crusades with this project, but one of the crusades that I went on was trying to get rid of all of the various memory leaks that were going on within this game. And that was quite the rabbit hole because I essentially had started developing, put in probably over a year's worth of work, maybe even a little more at that point. I don't remember the exact timeline, but put in a solid amount of work into this without ever checking for memory leaks. So then trying to track all those down with all kinds of classes and inheritance going on, it was a nightmare. And that was a multi-week process in and of itself. And through that process, I definitely wanted to chuck my computer out the window. And occasionally, even now, I still sometimes want to chuck my computer out the window. So even though, like, it does aggravate me from time to time, and occasionally make me want to throw the computer out the window, it also can have the complete opposite effect of essentially allow me to escape from the world, just dive deep into the code, bury myself in the code, get wrapped up in the code, and just essentially love life. And I don't know, maybe I'm crazy with this, because the other thing of it too, I guess, which kind of going back to wanting to throw the computer out the window, is at the end of the day, I'm getting mad at the computer because it's not doing what I want it to do. But in reality, because we are dealing with the nature of writing code, when you write code, you are explicitly telling the computer what you want it to do. So when the computer isn't, quote, doing what you want it to do, it's actually doing exactly what you told it to do. You just didn't tell it to do the thing that you wanted it to do, if that makes sense. So essentially, I wanted to throw my computer out the window because it was doing exactly what I told it to do, but what I told it to do wasn't what I wanted it to do. So anyway, I guess to again once and for all summarize things here. I know this is kind of a little bit of a shorter episode compared to previous weeks, but I don't feel like this necessarily needs to be dragged on. Yeah, so find something that you can enjoy and escape from the world, whether that is watching a movie, a TV show, reading a book, writing code, whatever the case may be, because man, was that quite an experience. I definitely enjoyed it, and it kind of, I guess maybe it's something I just took for granted. You know, there was that time like a few months ago where I was just going ham, like pretty much we had entire episodes where all I was doing was going over the updates I was making to this video game, and that's essentially all I was doing. And I jokingly made the comment of, should we rename the Nerdy Things segment to the weekly Scrum meeting or something like that, because that's essentially what it turned into at that point. And then, of course, over the past few weeks, it's been essentially the complete opposite. So maybe it was the fact that I grew so accustomed to the feeling of being able to enjoy just being by myself writing code that I forgot how amazing that felt. And then when I finally got back to doing that, I just was reminded of it. I don't know what it is. If you have an experience like that, definitely I'm interested to hear it. If you're on YouTube, you can leave a comment down below, or you can always shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. But of course, before we wrap up for this week, I think we should get back to our trivia question. So that is, what year was the Swift programming language announced? So again, what year was the Swift programming language announced? If you said 2014, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. So kind of hard to believe that Swift has been around for 10 years at this point. I remember a few years, well, I'd say a few years ago, is probably more than that, when I was first kind of getting into Swift and trying to do some iOS development. It was like this new kid on the block and everything, and now it's been over 10 years. So, which I guess in fairness, though, compared to a language like C, 10 years is still kind of a baby-like, since, of course, C came out in the 70s. So comparatively, Swift is, of course, still really, really young, but it's kind of hard to believe that it's been 10 years already. So, but that's going to do it for this episode. So I would ask that you leave it a rating and review and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Also, be sure to share with a friend or family member. We had a lot of good cybersecurity tidbits, I think, in here that probably deserve to be shared around. And if you have any questions about this episode or have any comments or topics for future episodes, be sure to either leave a comment down below if you're on YouTube, or you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. The link for that is down in the show notes below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.